Hello, and welcome into this week's lesson for American government. This week, we're going to be looking at the notion of rights, liberties, and entitlements. What the differences are between these things, right? How they impact you, right? This is really the area where American politics most interacts with your life on really kind of an everyday basis. So, we're going to be looking at a lot of different things this week, but our main focus is going to be on what the nature of rights are, what rights you have, and right the difference between rights, liberties, and entitlements. Often in our everyday lives, right, we use these terms kind of interchangeably, and there are some explicit and different things going on with each one of them. Right, so rights, liberties, and entitlements. I really want to make sure that this week we are being clear that they are three different categories of things. So let's go ahead and just dive in and start talking about what rights are. What are some different ways of conceiving of rights? And then we're going to get to what rights you have in your everyday life. So let's go ahead and look at this, shall we? So just right off the bat, I want to start with talking about right a couple of different conceptions of what rights are. Right. So the the first thing I really want to talk about is the difference between a positive right and a negative right. So the way I like to think of this is about where the right is. Right? So a right is ultimately speaking things that you're able to do. And typically we're talking about things that the government enables you. But in this case, right, there is kind of a difference between what's a positive right, something that's given to you, and a negative right, which is kind of protecting you from other people infringing on this thing in your life. So I like to think of it as a positive right is really much closer to what we think of as an entitlement. We're going to get to this in just a bit. So just bear with me. But a positive right is something that is given to you, right? The right to vote. Think of that like a positive right, right? You right. We don't inherently have some sort of right to vote, right? It is granted to us, right? It's given to us. Whereas a negative right is something like free speech, right? People, right? This particularly the government isn't allowed to infringe or impinge or impugn our right to speak the way we want to within certain bounds. Right? It's important to note in everything we're doing this week, there are certain boundaries that have been established right through a lot of those court cases we talked about last. Right. So a positive right is something that is granted to you, given to you. A negative right is something that you're protected from other people's actions. Right. Almost think of it as like a shield, whereas a positive right is something that's given to you. Taking that one step further, right? There's also this notion of natural rights versus legal rights. A natural right is a right that is given to you. Right. Well, a natural right is something that you automatically have, right? Because you're a human, right? Granted by God, your God given rights, your moral rights. These are the things that we have because we're human. Right? So, a right to liberty, a right to free speech, a right to free exercise of religion, a right to own property. Right? These are what we would think of as your natural rights. Whereas legal rights are rights that humans kind of give to ourselves. Right? We create these via laws. So again, going back to that example of a voting right, right? That is a really good example of a legal right, right? All right, a right to an education, a right to right do something as opposed to something that's inherently in who you are. Right. So a legal right has to be granted to you, created by a law. A natural right is something that you have because you're human, right? An inalienable right, something that can't be taken from you that you have because you're inherently human. Now, that's not to mean that these rights can't be infringed, but that they are right part of who we are as humans. And these rights typically are granted not to groups, but specifically to individuals. Right? It's individuals that are in our system granted rights. And right, that's really at the core of everything that we're going to be doing vis-a-vis rights, right? It is this notion that they are rights for individuals. So let's put an edge on that difference between rights, liberties, and entitlements. So right, we've got these three categories of things we're looking at this week. Right? These rights, liberties, and entitlements. When we're talking about a right, right, what we're dealing with there is something that we are able to do, right? Something that we have been enabled to do that the government actually empowers us to do. The best example for this is the ability to vote, right? For me, that is the number one example of what a granted right is. Right? Things that the government actually enables us to do. Liberties, on the other hand, are things that we are free to do. In many ways, I like to think of rights more in the notion of a positive right and a legal right. Whereas liberties are much more of negative rights, right? Being protected from someone else's actions. These are typically those natural rights sorts of things. Right? They're things that we are free to do. Speech, free exercise of religion, the ability to own property, the ability to defend ourselves. Right? Those are all things that I would classify actually as liberties as opposed to rights. Right. The third category here we're talking about are entitlements. These are actual like goods that are granted to us by the right the government actually like gives to us, not just an idea thing, but an actual tangible good or a somewhat intangible good, but it's something that you could actually put a dollar value. So an education would fit in here. Healthcare could fit in here, right? Government aid and government assistance typically fits in here as well. So, like I said, these are things like education, healthcare, social safety net stuff, right? The stuff that's written. But those are things that the government actually administers to us, that gives to us, right? These are the things that we actually use politics, right? The art of getting elected to determine who gets what and when and how. Those are kind of our entitlements. So a right, just to recap, is a thing that you are able to do and that the government actually helps you to do. So like vote. Right? There's other things in this category, but voting is the big one that really makes a lot of sense. Liberties are the things that you are free to do that you're free to do because you're human, and the government actually protects the doing of these things. Right? The government actually, it's their job. And in particular, right, they set up these rights and set up legal protections to make sure that the government itself does not infringe upon your right to do these liberties, right? Your ability to have these liberties. Now, the government isn't giving you the liberty, they're just making sure that you get to keep that, if that makes sense. Right? And that's why, right, I'm going to be available for y'all to check in with me on Discord to make sure that like you understand this. So don't be afraid to do. So let's talk about the rights that are actually given to us from the Constitution. The Constitution, um, in large part, creates a good bit of rights for us. In fact, I like to think of this as right the rights that exist in the original version of the Constitution versus the rights that came from the Bill of Rights. Right, the framers of the Constitution had a certain set of rights that they wanted to bake in to the laws from the beginning, and that actually there was a lot of view that there wasn't even a need for a Bill of Rights because the rights were covered in the Constitution and everything else was to be determined by the states. If it wasn't in the Constitution, then it automatically existed to the people. So, what are some of the rights that are actually in our Constitution as originally written without the Bill of Rights? Well, the first is the writ of habeas corpus. This is that the government has to provide a reason in order for you to be detained, in order for you to be arrested. The government has to give a reason why they're doing this, right? They can't just pull you off the side of the road and detain you for no reason. This is really important, right? This is why we generally have an assumption of free movement in this country, right? The government can't just demand that you, right? They can't just stop you from doing what you're doing unless they give you a specific reason why they're doing it. or why they're stopped. Additionally, there's no bills of attainder, right? You can't punish someone without having a trial. You can't just say this person is to be, beaten 30 times with a rat and cane and send them on their way. No, there actually has to be a trial for there to be punishment, right? They can't just hold you and put you in prison without actually having a trial for you. Right? Out on top of that, right? We cannot have Whew, excuse me, sorry about that. We can't have something called an ex post facto law, right? You can't make something a crime after it's already happened, right? In order for something to be a crime, there has to be a law against it before the activity happened. Um, so you can't do something and then the government be like, no, you can't do that. They have to have a reason why. A law is saying why you can't do that before you've committed the act in order for it to actually be a crime. Right? You can't create a law after the fact. Now, something that you might not think of as a right, because it's actually saying something that you can't do, is that there will be no titles of nobility. Now, the reason why I put this under rights is because what titles of nobility do is actually give unequal rights, right? Different rights to a different class of people based on that notion of nobility. So, in our Constitution, fundamentally and legally, everyone is to be treated the same, right? That's what this known titles of nobility is all about. That from a legal perspective, we're all meant to be treated legally the same, right? So that's a fundamental idea of equality baked in to our Constitution. Right? Additionally, right, we have freedom of movement between the states, right? Right, you get to carry rights between states. We talked about that at the beginning of this semester about how federalism works. Another important one is that you can't use the notion of treason, right? The crime of treason to actually punish some sort of other activity. Treason itself is its own crime. Now, it can still be punished by the death penalty. It still has some of the heaviest punishments on there, but treason is its own crime, not like oh, he was doing a bad thing and he also committed treason. Treason is its own distinct legal crime, right? It's a crime against the state itself. They also say that there can't be a religious test for the oaths of office, right? Right, they can't force you to be a certain religion to hold office in this country, which is pretty good. And also that there are extreme protections for contracts, right? There is a lot of protection against the impairment of contracts. The government can't get in the way of contracts. We get to make contracts among the people very heavily in this country, right? That is a protected right in this country, uh, in the original version of the Constitution. Now, most of the good stuff that we talk about uh, these days is actually comes a little bit later on, comes in with the Bill of Rights. James Madison was like, we don't really even need to do this. We already covered it. It's in the regular thing of the Constitution, but fine, I'll write it. I'm going to write a Bill of Rights just to make it clear for those of you in the back who didn't pay attention and didn't do the readings. Right? That's kind of basically what James Madison was doing. But these were actually passed at the same time as the Constitution, even though they are separate. Hmm. I'm sorry, it's a lot later than I thought it would be. It's been a long day. Right, so these Bill of Rights actually were only meant to apply to the national government until, of course, the 14th Amendment comes along the way, which actually slowly has been applying the Bill of Rights, right, the amendments to the Constitution to the states and the people more broadly. Um, and in general, the way this works is through the Due Process Clause, right? Right. In the 14th Amendment, there's something that says that everyone who's born in this country or is a citizen of this country will be afforded the due process necessary. And basically, what that does is it applies right. It says that everyone has to have their rights. If they're going to infringe upon their rights, it must go through due process. Uh, so yeah, that basically means that the Bill of Rights applies to the states as well as national. So let's talk about what some of these um, rights in the amendments do. So first and foremost, we have the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment, it's number one for a reason. It's got a lot of really, really good stuff. It actually has four major uh, parts to it, right? The first is that Congress shall make no law about the establishment of religion in this country, right? This gives us our freedom of religion, right? Not only a freedom from the state saying what religion we have to be, but it also grants us what we call the free exercise of religion, right? We are free to practice our religion in the way we want to practice it. Now, there are some limits on this, right? There is a pretty firm and firmly established principle called the separation between church and state. This isn't in the Constitution, but it is understood to be part of our legal rights in this country. And not only does this protect the state from religion, but it protects religion from the state. The state can't tell religion how to work, and the right religious forces cannot direct the way the state functions. And we also have the lemon test. We talked about that last week, but basically the government uh, has to, right, if they're going to give money to a religious organization, it has to meet this test that it's a secular purpose. It doesn't inhibit or advance religion, and it makes sure that there is no real major government entanglement with the religion, right? It's just the religious organization is delivering a social good on behalf of a government. That's pretty much it. Uh, yeah, right. So our freedom of religion is a pretty strong and upheld right within our system. The next part of the First Amendment, right, still in the First Amendment, is the idea of free speech. We talked a little bit about this last week as well, but really there's very limited boundaries on what can be impinged upon when it comes to free speech. Basically, unless it's libel, you're lying about what something did. Obscenity, which really over the course of the last 30 years has been rolled heavily back. And fighting words, like literally going to cause someone to want to fight you. Everything else is allowed. Um, of course, right, we talked about a court case, really put a little bit of a limit on it. But these free speech rights have actually been pretty heavily expanded um, over the course of the last 30 years. What we've seen is that individuals have a much stronger right. Commercial speech can be much more heavily restricted. Everything does have to pass a clear and present danger test, right? If you have a clear and present danger to our system, right, that can be, uh, right, that can be a limit. But generally speaking, most speech is protected speech in this country. Um, the thing that's the most protected is right making sure that you are allowed to say what you want, and really, the courts frown heavily on something called prior restraint, which is censorship before it even gets to publication. Right? The government can't say you cannot publish that before it's been published. Right? It has to be published first, and then come up to perhaps a um, right, perhaps some censorship there. So freedom of speech is very heavily protected in our system. Right, in the First Amendment, number one for a reason. There's the freedom of the press as well as freedom of the of assembly. Now, there are questions about what constitutes press at this point. We're seeing a lot of questioning about, um, particularly speech on the internet coming up. Section 230 of the Internet uh, Communications Act of 1990. People are really starting to question what that means again. I think we're probably going to see the courts come up with a very strong defense of freedom of speech on the internet. Um, that is something that is kind of currently being redrawn. But we generally have very strong rights to assembly and a right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So we're actually allowed to ask the government to explain why it's doing what it's doing. That's in the First Amendment. We also have a Second Amendment right. Moving on, the Second Amendment gives us a right to self defense, right? To armed self defense. That is pretty heavily enshrined in our Constitution at this point. Amendments 4, 5, well, really 3, but 3 is kind of a funky one. We've never really seen any heavy Third Amendment challenges, right? That's quartering of troops. We haven't really had that big of an issue, so we don't need to focus too much on that. Fourth and Fifth Amendments are about privacy, due process, right? So we have the ability to own things, right? There can be actual takings, regulatory takings are possible. The government can do this thing called civil asset forfeiture, where they take your stuff because you've committed a crime, but that's actually being undone to a large degree at this point. So we generally have pretty strong property rights in this country. We have very strong due process rights, particularly procedural due process. You've got to go through the right procedures to take someone's rights away from. Um, as criminals, right, we have a lot of heavy rights there. We have privacy rights as well. The Fourth Amendment gives us most of our privacy rights, even though they're not right expressed explicitly in the Constitution. They are viewed as being in there because of the Fourth Amendment. This is also where we get rights based on sexual orientation, based on right. The Fourth Amendment is kind of one of the key rights, giving us a lot of our freedom. The Fifth Amendment's all about the rights of criminal suspects. So it's protection against unreasonable search and seizure. That they have to have a search warrant in order to search your stuff. This is also where we get our Miranda rights and a right to remain silent, which remember you have to actually verbally ask for. If you want an attorney, you have to ask for an attorney. One of the more interesting cases recently is that you can't say, "No, I want a lawyer, dog." You actually have to say you want an attorney, and not that you want a lawyer, dog. Yeah. When you're dealing with the legal system, you have to be very clear uh, about what you want. You also have a right to a fair trial, which include right. We walked through this last class, but right, the government has to actually give you an indictment. Uh, you can't face what's called double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime twice. Right, a lot of interesting stuff. And of course, right, there's this idea that we all have equal protection under the law and that we all receive equal accommodations under the law, right? If everyone's going to be allowed to vote, we all get the same ability to vote. If everyone's going to right have civil rights, they're going to apply equally to everyone else. These have been enshrined via the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So these are really important, right? This means these rights apply to everyone, and that means everyone within the country. So if you live in this, if you not only live in this country, if you're in this country, you have access to these rights, right? The government must apply it to everyone. It's not just citizens. Um, but it applies to everyone, uh, which is really important, right? Something that really needs to be thinking. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about entitlements, right? So we talked about rights. Let's talk a little bit about the entitlements that our country has. So first and foremost, when we're talking about entitlements, we're talking about an actual good that can be provided. And there's really two types of goods that we're dealing with. There's what's called public goods and there's private goods, right? So a public good is a good that is given to everyone, right? So think of this like education. Think of this like the ability to drive on roads, right? A public good is something that a politician promises to everyone, and everyone's going to have some sort of access to. Whereas a private good is only provided to a select group of people, right? Essentially buying people off. Now, generally speaking, in this country, we rely heavily on what are called these public goods, right? Politicians promise to give the same set of things to everyone, right? So everyone's going to have access to the same goods. Now, that doesn't mean that the entitlements are typically given to everyone, right? In this country, while we provide goods to everyone, we like to think of entitlements as typically something that's going to be what we call means tested, right? To have access to an entitlement, you typically have to meet some sort of test, right? And what that means is that typically it's age or income. Sometimes ability, disability is implied there as well, but it's typically how old are you or how much money. Now, there can be large, wonky policy questions, and we're going to get to this when we come back next week, uh, talking about whether universal entitlements are better or means tested entitlements are better. But typically in this country, we've come down on the side of the means tested entitlement. And in particular, this applies on education. You have to be a certain age to receive educational benefits in this country. The social safety net, generally speaking, is provided for either old age or low income, and healthcare is typically provided by the government uh, for income or age, right? So you either have to be real poor to get on Medicare, you got to be old to get on Medicaid. Right? Those are really the ways that we do means testing in this country. So to wrap up, I know this is kind of a short lesson, but it's Thanksgiving, so I thought I'd go a little bit easy on you. To wrap up, right, I just want to recap and talk about the big core things here. Right, we have rights, which are the things that are granted to you and are enabled by the government. So think of that as the right to vote. A liberty is something that the government is not going to infringe upon and is actually going to protect for you, but is inherently yours because you're human, like a natural right. Things like a freedom of speech or the freedom to exercise and practice your religion as you. And an entitlement is a good, right? A physical, tangible good or something you can put a dollar value on. The government is going to provide. And typically, we do those in this country via means testing. Now, when we come back next week, we're going to talk much more heavily about how we make these decisions, right? There are spending decisions that need to be made. There are decisions about who gets what and how, right? That's really what I think of as policy. And that's what we're going to focus more heavily on for the next 2 weeks. But today, right, was a nice bridge to understand how we enact these things, right? Rights, liberties, and entitlements. Uh, so yeah, that's going to do it. Remember to take your quiz. It's going to be a 3-question quiz, and make sure you get that in by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And then we will come back next week and talk about the policy process. Right? Talk about public policy. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message on Discord, and have a great Thanksgiving.